November 1982. The Barents Sea. Captain First Rank Victor DeGarlo stood in the cramped control room of the K-324, a Victor III class nuclear attack submarine, the pride of the Soviet Northern Fleet. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, machine oil, and the sweat of men who had been submerged for 37 days. DeGarlo was not nervous, he was confident. He had every reason to be. The K-324 was a ghost. It was the culmination of 20 years of Soviet submarine development, designed for one singular purpose: to hunt American carrier battle groups in the North Atlantic without being detected. Its hull was coated in a special anechoic rubber, tiles that absorbed enemy sonar pings like a sponge drinks water. Its reactor was mounted on shock absorbers to reduce mechanical noise. Even its propeller, its 7-bladed masterpiece, was designed to turn at speeds that produced almost no cavitation, no telltale bubbles. On paper, in testing, in every simulation run by the Soviet Navy's Acoustic Institute, the Victor III was functionally invisible to American passive sonar. It was quieter than the background noise of the ocean itself. DeGarlo had been briefed at Severomorsk before departure. The mission was simple, almost routine. Transit submerged through the Gyuk Gap, the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This was the choke point, the gateway to the Atlantic. If war came, this is where Soviet submarines would have to pass to reach the American convoys resupplying Europe. The Americans knew this. They had been watching this gap for decades, but DeGarlo had been assured, repeatedly, by the admirals, by the engineers, by the political officers, that the Americans could not hear them anymore. Not the Victor III, not the new generation. He checked the chart. They were approaching the gap now, 200 meters deep, cruising at a leisurely 8 knots, slow and silent. His sonar officer, a young lieutenant named Borodin, sat hunched over his passive sonar display, headphones clamped to his ears, listening to the ocean. He heard the biological noise, the crackle of shrimp, the groan of whales, the hiss of waves far above. He heard nothing mechanical. No American destroyers, no prowling P-3 Orion aircraft dropping snowboys. Nothing. "Captain," Borodin reported, pulling one earphone aside, "the ocean is clear, no contacts." DeGarlo nodded. This was expected. This was doctrine. The Soviet Navy had spent billions of rubles, had sacrificed comfort, speed and firepower, all in the pursuit of one thing: silence. And now, in this moment, crossing the most surveilled piece of ocean on the planet, they were proving that it had worked. They were invisible. 6 hours later, as they cleared the gap and entered the open Atlantic, DeGarlo allowed himself a rare smile. They had done it. They had transited the American tripwire without a whisper. In a few days, they would surface briefly to transmit a coded burst. Mission success. The Americans are deaf. But 3,000 kilometers away, in a bunker that did not officially exist, buried deep beneath a rocky hillside in the North Atlantic, an American sonar technician was staring at a waterfall display on his screen. He saw a thin, faint line, barely distinguishable from the noise moving slowly southwest. He reached for his headset. Contact. Designate Sierra 27. Probable Victor III class. He noted the time, the position, the bearing. The line was added to a map that had been tracking Soviet submarines for hours, for days, for years. The Soviets had no idea. They had just walked through a door they believed was locked, and on the other side someone had been waiting, watching, and writing down their every move. This is the story of the most catastrophic intelligence failure in Soviet naval history. It is the mystery of the submarine that thought it was invisible. It is the story of SOSUS, and the moment the Soviet Union realized that the Atlantic Ocean, their highway to war, was not an ocean at all. It was a cage, and the Americans had been listening all along. For the Soviet Union, the submarine was not just a weapon. It was a lifeline, a theological necessity. Look at a map. The Soviet coastline is vast, but it is a prisoner. In the north, the Northern Fleet is bottled up in the Barents Sea, forced to squeeze through the Gyuk Gap to reach the Atlantic. In the east, the Pacific Fleet is locked behind the narrow straits of Japan. In the west, the Baltic Fleet is trapped in a shallow inland sea, controlled by NATO choke points. The Soviet Navy was a giant in chains, and those chains were geography. The entire Soviet war plan for World War III depended on breaking those chains. If the war came, if the tanks rolled west toward the Rhine, they would need to survive long enough to reach the English Channel, and that meant stopping the Americans from reinforcing Europe. NATO had a plan, a well-rehearsed, terrifying plan, to flood Europe with men and material. Tens of thousands of American soldiers, hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel and tanks, all of it would have to cross the Atlantic in massive convoys, just as it had in World War II. The Soviet answer was the submarine. They would unleash their fleet of nuclear attack boats, dozens of them, into the Atlantic. They would hunt the convoys, they would sink the transports, they would turn the ocean into a graveyard and starve NATO into submission. But this plan, this entire doctrine rested on a single unshakable assumption. The submarines had to reach the Atlantic undetected. If the Americans knew they were coming, if they could track them, if they could hunt them, then the Soviet submarines would be the ones in the graveyard, killed before they ever fired a shot. This is why the Victor 30 was so important. It was not just a submarine, it was the key to the war, and the Soviet Navy believed, with absolute conviction, that the key worked. They had tested it. They had measured it. They had compared it to American submarines captured in technical intelligence, to the noise levels of the American Los Angeles class. The Victor III was quieter. The math said so. The engineers said so. The admirals reported this to Moscow with pride. "Comrade General Secretary, we have achieved acoustic superiority. The Americans cannot hear us." But in the spring of 1983, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. It started with whispers, with uncomfortable reports from submarine captains returning from patrol. Captain DeGarlo was not the only one. Other commanders, veterans of the Northern Fleet, men who had spent their entire careers underwater, began reporting the same strange, unsettling phenomenon. They would transit the Guyuk Gap, silent, undetected, certain they had slipped past the American sensors, and then, days later, as they operated in the open Atlantic, they would suddenly find themselves shadowed. An American P-3 Orion patrol aircraft would appear on the horizon, dropping sonar buoys in a perfect search pattern as if it knew exactly where to look. An American Los Angeles-class attack submarine would ping them with active sonar, a humiliating, aggressive declaration, "I see you." Or worse, they would surface for a scheduled communication burst, and an American destroyer would be sitting there, waiting 5 kilometers away, as if it had been following them the entire time. The first few times, the Soviet commanders assumed it was bad luck, a coincidence. The Atlantic is a big ocean, but it is not infinite. Perhaps the Americans had gotten lucky. Perhaps a fishing trawler had spotted their periscope. Perhaps they had made a mistake, run their reactor too loud, cavitated their propeller for just a moment. But the pattern continued. It was not every patrol, but it was too often to be chance. The Soviet submarine force was supposed to be a ghost fleet. Instead, they were being found again and again with a consistency that defied probability. In the secure briefing rooms of the Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk, the mood shifted from confidence to confusion, and then to a creeping cold dread. The admirals demanded explanations. Are our boats making noise? Are the crews incompetent? Are there defects in the anechoic coating? Teams of acoustic engineers were dispatched. They ran tests. They measured the Victor III submarines in acoustic ranges, special enclosed bays where every sound could be analysed. The submarines were quiet. They were performing exactly as designed. The engineers reported back, "There is no defect. The boats are silent." Then how? The admirals demanded. How are the Americans finding them? The investigation was launched, not with fanfare, but with paranoia. The GRU and the KGB were brought in. The first theory was sabotage, a mole. Perhaps the Americans had an agent inside the Northern Fleet, someone radioing the position of every submarine as it left port. The KGB launched a mole hunt. They interrogated officers. They monitored communications. They found nothing. The second theory was space. Perhaps the Americans had developed a new type of reconnaissance satellite, something that could see beneath the waves, using radar or infrared or some exotic technology. The Soviet space tracking network was tasked with monitoring every American satellite pass over the North Atlantic. They correlated the satellite orbits with the times when Soviet submarines were detected. There was no correlation. The satellites were not the answer. The third theory, The most disturbing was that the Americans had developed a new type of sonar, something beyond anything the Soviets understood. Perhaps it was mounted on their submarines, or on their aircraft, or on their destroyers. Perhaps it was so powerful, so sensitive, that it could hear a Victor III submarine even through its anechoic coating. Soviet technical intelligence was ordered to find out. They monitored American naval exercises. They analysed every piece of Western naval literature they could find. They debriefed every defector, every source, every agent. And slowly, over months of desperate searching, a name began to appear. Not in any classified document, but in obscure technical journals, in budget hearings, in the occasional slip by a retired American admiral. SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. The Soviets had heard of it before, of course. They knew the Americans had underwater listening devices, hydrophones, placed on the seafloor during the Cold War. But their understanding was that SOSUS was old, a 1950s technology, designed to detect the loud, clattering diesel submarines of that era. The Victor III was a nuclear submarine, a technological generation ahead. Surely, the Soviets reasoned, SOSUS could not hear them. But the reports kept coming. The submarines kept being found. And in the classified conference rooms of Moscow, a terrifying possibility began to take shape. What if SOSUS was not old? What if the Americans had been lying, downplaying, hiding the true capability of their underwater network? What if the ocean was not empty? What if, beneath the waves, the Americans had built something the Soviets had never imagined? The investigation was no longer about finding an answer. It was about confronting a nightmare. And the nightmare had a name whispered in the hallways of the Admiralty with the kind of fear usually reserved for the supernatural. The Americans, it seemed, had turned the entire Atlantic Ocean into a listening device, and every Soviet submarine that entered it was not a hunter, it was prey. The answer, the source of the Soviet Union's growing horror, was not hidden in a secret laboratory or locked in a CIA vault. It was lying on the bottom of the ocean, silent, patient, and utterly invisible to Soviet reconnaissance. It had been there for decades. The Americans had not built a new weapon. They had built a net so vast, so sensitive, and so secret that even now, in the 21st century, its full capabilities remain classified. The net was SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, and it was a triumph of American engineering that the Soviets had catastrophically underestimated. The story of SOSUS begins not in the Cold War but in World War II, with a problem. German U-boats were sinking Allied convoys faster than they could be replaced. The submarines were invisible, striking from the depths and vanishing. The solution was sonar, but shipboard sonar was limited. It was noisy, it was short-ranged. It required a ship to be near the submarine to hear it. After the war, a group of American scientists asked a simple, radical question. What if we didn't put the sonar on the ship? What if we put it in the ocean itself? The ocean, they realized, was not silent. It was a transmission medium. Sound travels through water far more efficiently than through air. A whale's song can be heard across entire ocean basins. If you placed a sensitive enough microphone, a hydrophone, on the seafloor in the right location, you could theoretically hear a submarine hundreds, perhaps thousands of kilometers away. The challenge was choosing the right location. The ocean floor is not flat. It is a landscape of mountains, valleys, and trenches. Sound bends as it travels through water, refracting through layers of different temperatures and salinity. But there are acoustic highways, deep channels where sound waves can travel for astonishing distances with very little loss. These are called SOFAR channels, sound fixing and ranging channels, and they exist at specific depths in every ocean. In the 1950s, the US Navy began a secret project. They planted arrays of hydrophones, not just one or two, but hundreds of them, in clusters on the seafloor along these SOFAR channels. Each array was connected by undersea cables to remote shore stations, where the signals were processed. The first installations were placed across the Gyuk Gap, the choke point that every Soviet submarine had to pass to reach the Atlantic. The Soviets knew something was there. Their intelligence was not blind. But what they didn't know was the scale, the sensitivity, and most critically, the evolution. By the 1980s, SOSUS was not the crude 1950s technology the Soviets believed it to be. It had been upgraded again and again with each generation of American electronics. The hydrophones were now so sensitive they could detect a submarine cavitating its propeller from over 1,000 kilometers away. The shore stations were no longer staffed by sailors with headphones. They were staffed by trained acoustic analysts, sitting in front of computer displays, using pattern recognition algorithms to filter out biological noise, to track multiple contacts simultaneously, to build a real-time map of every submarine in the Atlantic. The Soviet Victor III submarine, for all its anechoic tiles and quiet machinery, was not silent. Nothing is truly silent. It hummed with the faint whine of reactor coolant pumps. It vibrated with the rotation of its propeller. These sounds were quiet, yes, far quieter than the older Soviet submarines, but they were not zero. And SOSUS, with its hundreds of hydrophones listening patiently from the abyss, could hear that whisper. Here is what the Soviets did not understand. SOSUS was not trying to hear the submarine up close. It was not looking for a loud, obvious signal. It was looking for a pattern, a faint anomaly in the background noise of the ocean. The American operators called it the art of the waterfall. They would watch their displays looking for a thin, barely visible line slowly crawling down the screen, a line that persisted, that moved at submarine speed, that behaved like a submarine. Once they had that line, they didn't need to hear every detail. They just needed to know it was there. The moment a Soviet submarine crossed the Gurk Gap, the SOSUS arrays would detect it. The detection would not be precise, not down to the meter, but it was enough. The shore station would calculate a rough position and a bearing. This information would be transmitted not to the submarine's location, but to a central command center. From there, the hunt would begin. A P-3 Orion aircraft, already on patrol, would be vectored to the area. It would drop a pattern of sonar buoys, active and passive, refining the position. If the submarine was important enough, if it was a ballistic missile boat or a particularly threatening attack sub, a Los Angeles-class submarine, already lurking nearby, would be quietly directed to shadow it. The Soviet submarine captain, confident in his silence, would have no idea that he had been tagged the moment he left port. This was the system of systems the Soviets had failed to comprehend. SOSUS was not a single listening device. It was a network, a web of sensors, aircraft, ships and submarines, all coordinated, all sharing information. It was the underwater equivalent of the radar networks that had detected the Germans in World War II. But it was invisible, impossible to jam, and nearly impossible to destroy. The Soviet response, when the truth finally began to dawn on them in the mid-1980s, was not calm. It was panic. The entire Soviet naval strategy was built on the assumption of stealth. If their submarines could not reach the Atlantic undetected, then their war plan was worthless. Their submarines would be hunted down and sunk before they ever fired a torpedo. The Soviet Navy ordered an emergency review. They pulled out every scrap of intelligence on SOSUS. They analyzed the locations of suspected hydrophone arrays. They developed countermeasures, theories, desperate plans. The first idea was to cut the cables. If the hydrophones were connected to shore stations by undersea cables, then those cables could be severed by special Spetsnaz teams or by submarines equipped with cutting tools. But the cables were deep, buried in the silt of the ocean floor in some places, and the Americans had redundant routes. Cutting one cable would not blind the system. The second idea was deception. If SOSUS was listening for the acoustic signature of a submarine, then perhaps the Soviets could flood the ocean with false signals, noise generators, decoys. They began developing devices that could mimic the sound of a submarine, to be deployed from aircraft or surface ships, hoping to overwhelm the American analysts with false contacts. But this was a game of cat and mouse, and the Americans were very good at distinguishing real submarines from decoys. The third idea, the most desperate, was to go louder, not quieter. If stealth was impossible, if the ocean was a cage, then perhaps the answer was speed. Soviet designers began working on submarines that would sprint, that would cross the Atlantic at maximum speed, accepting that they would be detected but hoping to reach their targets before they could be killed. This was the philosophy behind the Alpha class, a submarine so fast, so expensive, and so temperamental that only a few were ever built. But deep down, the Soviet Admiralty knew the truth. They had lost. They had lost not because their submarines were poorly designed, but because they had been fighting a war they didn't know existed. While they had focused on making their boats quieter, the Americans had focused on making the ocean itself into a sensor. While the Soviets had built better submarines, the Americans had built a better net. The final confrontation came not in a battle, but in a quiet, humiliating realization that trickled through the Soviet Navy in the late 1980s. The Americans didn't just know where their submarines were. The Americans had known for decades. Every patrol, every transit, every secret mission had been watched, tracked, and filed away. The Soviet submarine force, which they believed to be their ace, their hidden dagger, had been an open book. In 1986, a high-ranking Soviet naval officer defected to the West. In his debriefings, he was shown maps that detailed the movements of Soviet submarines over years. The precision was terrifying. The Americans could tell him where specific submarines had been on specific dates, what routes they had taken, even when they had gone deep to evade detection. It had all been recorded. The mystery was solved. The Soviet submarines had not been ghosts. They had been specimens, tracked and catalogued like migrating whales. The Cold War beneath the waves was not a stalemate. It was a one-sided slaughter waiting to happen. And the Soviets, for all their engineering brilliance, had never stood a chance. The Americans had turned the ocean into a weapon, and the Soviets had been swimming in it blind for 20 years.